If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. When the channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, I'll share a surprise story I've prepared especially for you. The marketplace in Antioch was crowded and restless under the midday sun. Dust hung in the air, stirred up by the sandals of buyers and the hooves of mules. Traders shouted over one another, each trying to draw attention to their wares: grain, oil, fabrics, livestock, and among them, human beings. The smell of sweat, damp straw, and animal dung carried through the square. At the far end, near a wooden platform, stood the group of slaves brought for sale that morning. Their wrists and ankles were bound with iron cuffs, and the ropes tying them to the post left red marks on their skin. Most avoided eye contact, staring at the ground as the auctioneer called out their strengths and ages. Celine was among them. She was in her early 20s, thin from months of poor food, her dark hair unwashed, falling into her face. Her simple wool tunic hung loosely, showing her collarbones and the scars of lashings across her back. She had been sold twice before, first taken after a raid near the border of Cappadocia, then passed between traders who treated her as property. She no longer expected mercy. Each time a buyer stepped close, her stomach tightened, waiting for the same cycle to begin again. She looked down, not wanting to meet any gaze, afraid it might be taken as defiance. The crowd shifted when an older man stepped forward. His name was Gaius Marcellus, a landowner from the countryside west of Antioch. He was over 60, his shoulders rounded, his beard gray and thick. His skin was marked by years of sun and fieldwork. Though he owned land, his estate was not large, and age had left him more fragile than he cared to admit. The years had also left him alone. His wife and son had both died from fever a decade earlier. Since then, he had worked his vineyard and olive groves with a few hired men, living in silence and debt, carrying on out of habit more than purpose. He had not come to the market to buy workers. He despised the cruelty of the auctions, though he rarely voiced it. But he had heard that a shipment of captives would arrive today, and against his better judgment, he came, not for labor, but because he could not shake the memory of how powerless he had felt when his own family suffered and no one helped them. He did not want to watch another young life wasted if he had the means to intervene. When Celine was pushed forward by the auctioneer, Gaius watched her closely. He noticed her tense shoulders, the way she flinched at the man's hand on her arm, and the dull hopelessness in her eyes. He felt something stir in him, a mix of pity and anger at what had been done to her. He knew she would expect nothing but exploitation from whoever purchased her. 200 denarii, the auctioneer called, waving his hand at the crowd. A few men muttered. One laughed and shook his head. The bids were low. She looked frail, unfit for hard labor. I will pay 300, Gaius said, his voice steady. The auctioneer blinked, surprised. The price was high for her condition. He looked at Gaius with suspicion, but accepted the offer. A guard unlocked her shackles and shoved her forward. Celine stumbled, steadying herself on her knees before pushing herself upright again. Her first thought was disbelief. Why would an old man waste so much money on her? She studied him from the corner of her eye. He didn't wear the clothes of a wealthy merchant, nor the armor of a soldier. His tunic was plain, patched at the edges. His hands looked used as tools, not whips. Still, she kept her guard up. Mercy was a word she no longer trusted. Gaius reached into his pouch and handed the coins over. Then he turned to her. For a moment, he simply looked at her, tired eyes meeting cautious ones. His words came slowly, almost awkwardly, but with weight. You're no longer a slave. You will not serve anyone again. You are free. The sentence hung in the air. People in the crowd whispered to each other. Some laughed. Others scoffed, calling him a fool. Celine's body tightened. She wanted to believe him, but years of betrayal warned her not to. Freedom, if it existed, had never been offered to her without a cost. Her mind raced. What does he want in return? Is this another trick? Will he demand things later, when we are away from the crowd? Gaius did not press her. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder, not pushing, not gripping, only resting it there as if to steady her. Then he turned to walk out of the market. Celine hesitated before following. Her chains were gone, but the fear was not. Still, something in his manner, the calmness, the lack of demand, made her step after him. As they left the noisy square, both carried their own unspoken burdens. She with the scars of captivity, he with the weight of loneliness and guilt. Neither trusted the other yet. But in that moment, their lives had crossed, and nothing would be the same again. The road leaving Antioch wound through dry hills, past olive groves and scattered farms. Dust rose with every step of their mule. Celine walked a few paces behind Gaius, her eyes flicking between him and the horizon. She had no chains now, yet every sound of metal from passing wagons made her body stiffen. The crowd from the market had laughed when he declared her free, and the echo of their disbelief followed her with each mile. She kept wondering, if I am truly free, why am I following him? Why not run? The truth was she had nowhere to go. She had been taken far from her home years ago, and even if she escaped, she would only be caught again, or worse. The roads were full of patrols, traders, and thieves. For now, the old man's presence was the lesser danger. Gaius did not speak much during the journey. He carried himself with the weary patience of someone long accustomed to silence. Yet he was not indifferent. He glanced back at her often, making sure her pace did not falter. When the sun reached its peak, he stopped by a shaded grove, unpacked a small loaf of bread and a water jug, and set them before her. He did not eat until she did. Celine studied him carefully in those pauses. He looked nothing like the cruel men who had traded her before. His clothes were plain, his sandals dusty, his tunic patched in several places. His hands, scarred from years of vineyard work, had the stiffness of old injuries. He was not rich, and yet he had spent 300 denarii for her, far more than her value as a laborer. That unsettled her most of all. Why would he waste so much on me? By the second night, they reached his estate. It was smaller than she expected, not the grand villa of a powerful landowner, but a modest house with a tiled roof, a courtyard, and rows of vines stretching into the hills. The walls bore cracks from years of weather, and the wooden beams creaked in the wind. The land around it was quiet, no other slaves or servants in sight, only the distant sound of goats. Celine's first thought was suspicion. Does he live alone? Then why bring me here? She lingered at the gate, her chest tight with mistrust. Gaius pushed the heavy door open and gestured for her to enter. Inside, the air was cool, carrying the faint smell of oil lamps and dust. There were no guards, no locks, only the silence of an old man's home. He showed her a small room with a bed of straw and a wool blanket folded neatly. She hesitated at the threshold. No one had ever offered her a space of her own. It felt like a trap. She looked at him, waiting for the demand that must surely follow. Instead, he said only, "Rest. You are safe here." His voice was flat, not tender but honest. Then he left her alone. That night, Celine did not sleep on the bed. She lay on the floor, close to the door, ready to flee if he entered. Every creak of the house set her on edge. She kept her eyes open until exhaustion finally pulled her into uneasy rest. Meanwhile, Gaius sat in the main room by the dim light of a lamp. His thoughts were heavy. He had brought her away from the auction, but now he questioned what came next. He did not need more labor for the vineyard, and he had no family left to share the estate. His only reason had been the impulse to stop her from falling into the same misery he had witnessed too many times. Yet he wondered if she would ever believe him, or if his presence alone reminded her of all the men who had taken her freedom before. By morning, the rhythm of the estate resumed as it always had. Gaius rose early to tend the vineyard. He took his tools, moving slowly but steadily down the rows of vines, pruning and tying them with twine. Celine, watching from the doorway, expected to be called or ordered. No command came. He worked alone, his back bent, his hands firm despite his age. Hours later, he returned to the villa, sweat streaking his tunic. Without a word, he set a loaf of bread on the table and left a cup of water before her. She stared at it, her pulse quickening, waiting for the hidden price. But he only sat across the table, eating his portion silently. The simple act of leaving her share untouched until she chose to eat made her chest tighten with confusion. Questions pressed in her mind. What does he want? Why does he not treat me as the others did? Am I truly free here, Or is the trap waiting later? She did not voice them, but the silence between them was heavy with her suspicion. For Gaius, the silence was something different. He had lived in it for many years, since the deaths of his wife and son. He did not find it uncomfortable. What surprised him was how much the silence between himself and Celine was alive, thick with her unspoken fear, her distrust, and his own struggle to show he meant no harm. He did not know how long it would take for her to believe him, but he resolved not to force it. Thus, their days began in quiet routine. She watching him, unsure whether to trust, and he continuing his life as it had been, but now with someone else in the villa. The uneasy beginning of a bond had been laid, though neither could yet see it. The mornings at the villa always began the same way. The creak of the wooden doors, the smell of damp earth, and the steady footsteps of Gaius walking to the vineyard before the sun grew harsh. Celine watched him from the doorway each day, her arms wrapped around herself, uncertain if she was expected to follow. He never ordered her. He simply worked, bent over the vines, his movements slow but deliberate. It unsettled her even more than commands might have. On the third morning, Celine felt the silence pressing on her. She could not remain idle. Fear gnawed at her. If she did nothing, would he one day decide she was useless and cast her out? Survival had taught her that doing nothing was never safe. Without asking, she took a clay jar to the well and pulled water, carrying it back to the villa. When Gaius returned hours later, he noticed the jar filled and placed neatly on the table. He said nothing, only gave a short nod. For Celine, that silence was both a relief and a torment. She wondered, did I do what he wanted? Does he approve? Or does his quiet mean nothing at all? She wished he would speak more, yet part of her feared what words might bring. That evening, while Gaius mended a harness by the hearth, Celine quietly gathered his cloak, which had been torn at the edge. She carried it to her room and spent the night patching it with rough stitches. In the morning, she folded it neatly by his bed. When he found it, his fingers lingered over the stitches. He did not ask why she had done it. He only wore it without comment, though his expression carried a weight that Celine noticed, gratitude, restrained and quiet. The audience might have wondered why Celine did not simply leave now that she was free. This question lingered in her own thoughts as well. The answer was both practical and emotional. She had no family to return to. The roads beyond Antioch were dangerous, filled with slave catchers, thieves, and soldiers. A woman traveling alone would not last long. But beyond survival, something else bound her to the villa, a growing sense of safety, fragile and uncertain, yet stronger than anything she had known in years. One evening, as the sun fell and painted the vineyard in long shadows, Gaius sat down to eat. He placed 2 bowls of lentils on the table. He had done this each night since they arrived, but Celine had always hesitated, waiting until he had finished before taking her share. That night, he looked at her and spoke directly for the first time in days. "You should sit." The words were simple, but his tone carried no command, only an invitation. Celine's chest tightened. Her instinct was to refuse, to avoid drawing attention, but she forced herself to step closer. She sat at the edge of the bench, tense, ready to retreat at the slightest hint of anger. Gaius did not look at her with impatience. He ate his food slowly, leaving space for her to do the same. She raised the spoon to her lips, her hands shaking slightly. The food was plain, but for the first time in years, she ate without fear of punishment for taking too much or too little. As the nights passed, this routine settled into something steady. She began to sit earlier, sometimes even placing bread on the table herself. Their words were few, but their actions built something unspoken. When she brought water, he carried firewood. When she swept dust from the floor, he left sharpened tools at the doorway for her use. Still, the questions that had haunted her since the marketplace remained. Why me? Why do he spend so much coin? Does he seek a servant? Or does he truly mean to give me freedom? The silence between them did not answer, but she began to sense that his restraint was not indifference. It was choice. He had lived with loss long enough to know that forcing closeness would only drive her away. For Gaius, each small gesture from Celine, each jar filled, each piece of cloth mended, was a reminder of what it meant to live alongside another person. He had not expected her to stay. He had half believed she would vanish one morning and never return. Yet each day she remained, cautious but present. And with every passing day, the house felt less like an empty monument to his grief. By the end of the third week, the silence that once felt heavy began to change. It no longer pressed Celine into fear. Instead, it began to carry a strange kind of safety, as if words were not required to survive here. When she lay down at night, she still kept to the floor, close to the door, but now, for the first time in years, she slept through the night without waking in terror. The summer days on the estate passed in steady rhythm, but the calm was broken one night when the air grew heavy and the sky darkened with low clouds. The storm came suddenly, first with wind that tore at the vines and rattled the shutters, then with rain that fell in thick sheets. The villa's old beams groaned under the weight of the downpour. Celine had been lying awake, listening to the rain, when she heard the sharp crack of wood outside. She rushed to the courtyard and saw one of the gates trembling on its hinges, the force of the storm threatening to rip it free. Gaius was already there, his tunic soaked, trying to brace the wooden frame with his shoulders. His movements were slow but stubborn, his back straining against the pressure of the wind. Without thinking, Celine ran to his side. The cold rain stung her skin, but she pressed her hands against the gate, forcing it back into place. The wind howled, pulling at her hair and tunic, but she gritted her teeth and leaned her weight against the wood. For the first time since arriving, she acted without fear of consequence, driven by the instinct to protect the place that was beginning to feel like more than a shelter. They worked together, shouting brief words over the roar of the storm. Gaius tied a rope across the gate, his hands clumsy from the cold, and Celine helped secure the knots. When another beam threatened to snap near the roof, she climbed onto the ledge without hesitation, holding it steady while he reinforced it with rope. The rain soaked them both, their hands slipping, their bodies shivering from exhaustion. When the storm finally passed, the courtyard was flooded ankle-deep. Tiles lay broken on the ground, and branches littered the vineyard. Celine's arms trembled from strain, her chest rising and falling rapidly. She looked at Gaius, his face pale from effort, his beard dripping with rain. For the first time, she saw him not only as the old man who had bought her freedom, but as a person struggling with his own limits, carrying burdens she could recognize. A short laugh escaped her lips, unplanned, startled at the sight of themselves soaked, filthy, yet standing together in the wreckage. Gaius turned to her, his expression softening. He allowed himself a faint smile, the first she had ever seen from him. That night, they sat by the hearth, drying their clothes near the fire. The silence between them was different now, filled with shared survival rather than guarded distance. Celine no longer sat apart. She moved closer to the warmth, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. She ate beside him without hesitation, her fear dulled by the memory of fighting the storm together. The audience might have wondered why Celine had risked herself so openly, when before she had been cautious in every step. The answer was simple. The storm had left no time for hesitation. In those moments of danger, instinct had stripped away her doubts. And when Gaius did not scold her for taking charge or punish her for acting on her own, a new truth took root. She was no longer waiting for orders, nor was she waiting for betrayal. She was beginning to see that his silence did not hide cruelty. Gaius, for his part, noticed how quickly she had acted. She could have stayed inside, pretending the storm was not her problem, but she had chosen to stand beside him. That choice struck him deeply. He saw not a frightened slave girl anymore, but a woman whose strength had been buried under years of fear. As the firelight flickered across the stone walls, Celine's eyes no longer carried only suspicion. There was something else now, a cautious trust, fragile but real. She did not speak it aloud, and neither did he, but both of them felt the change. The storm had left its mark, not just on the villa, but on the distance between them. The morning after the storm, the vineyard lay scattered with broken branches, and tiles from the villa's roof were piled near the gate. The damage was not beyond repair, but it would take days of labor to restore order. Gaius rose early, as he always did, though his movements were slower than usual, his back stiff from the night before. Celine followed him into the courtyard, no longer waiting for instruction. She gathered fallen branches, carried them to the side, and set about clearing the flooded pathways. Her decision to work beside him was no longer born out of fear or caution. Something had shifted. The storm had made her realize that if she did nothing, the place where she now lived would collapse, and she did not want that. Survival alone was not her reason anymore. She wanted the villa to stand, because for the first time in years, she felt it could be a place where she belonged. As they worked, questions pressed on her. She had lived with him for weeks, yet she knew almost nothing about him beyond his name and his silence. Why had he chosen to buy her, when he clearly needed no servants? Why did he live alone in a house built for a family? And why did his eyes sometimes linger on the graves in the olive grove with such quiet weight? That evening, when the tools were set aside and the fire burned low, Celine spoke the question she had carried since the marketplace. Her voice was low, uncertain, but firm. You paid more than I was worth. Why? Gaius was silent for a long time, staring at the fire. At last, he answered, because I could not leave you there. I have seen enough suffering to know what would have become of you. That was reason enough. His tone was steady, but Celine pressed further. And what of your family? Why is this house so empty? The question made his jaw tighten. He shifted, his hand running over his beard before he replied. My wife and son died. Fever took them both 10 years ago. Since then, I have lived here alone. The land keeps me occupied, but does not speak back. It does not answer when I return home at night. His voice grew quieter. I did not go to the market to find company, but when I saw you standing there, I could not walk away. Celine lowered her gaze. She felt the weight of his words. For the first time, she saw him not just as the man who had taken her from the auction, but as someone scarred by loss, carrying loneliness as heavy as her own fear. She did not share her past immediately. The memories were jagged, difficult to voice. Yet that night, lying awake, she thought of the village where she had once lived, of the raid that tore her family apart, of the years of being passed from hand to hand like a possession. She wondered if he would believe her story, or if he would dismiss it as unimportant. But the small truth she now recognized was this. He had given her no reason to doubt that her voice would be heard. The next day, she found him near the vineyard, sitting on a stone wall, his tools resting at his side. She sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, slowly, she began to speak. She told him of her village, of her parents, of the men who had taken her, and of the years that followed. She did not cry. The pain was too old, too worn. But her voice shook as she described the constant fear, the emptiness of never belonging anywhere. Gaius listened without interruption. He did not offer false comfort or empty words. When she finished, he placed a hand lightly on her shoulder, the same way he had on the day of the auction, and said, No one will take you again. Not while I live. That vow was simple, but for Celine, it was the first promise anyone had ever made to her without hidden conditions. For the first time, she believed it. The audience might have wondered why she had not already claimed her freedom, why she had stayed in a place where an older man could still choose to control her life. The answer became clear in that moment. She was no longer here because she had no choice. She was here because she was beginning to trust that he meant what he said. As the days passed, their routines changed. Celine no longer avoided his gaze at the table. She met his eyes when he spoke, even if only briefly. She began to laugh softly at small things. The goats bleating in the courtyard, the stubborn mule refusing to move. Gaius noticed these small sounds with quiet wonder, as though the house itself was breathing again after years of silence. The villa was still old, the vineyard still demanding, and their lives still plain, but something had shifted. Where once they had lived side by side in silence, now there was an unspoken bond. Two people scarred by loss, finding in each other the beginnings of a family neither thought they would have again. The harvest season arrived with the heavy scent of grapes ripening on the vine. The storm had left its scars, but the vineyard endured, and the branches bent under the weight of clustered fruit. Celine walked beside Gaius through the rows, carrying baskets, her steps sure and steady. She no longer followed hesitantly behind him as she had on the road from Antioch. Now she matched his pace, moving as though the vineyard were her own. For weeks, she had worked without asking, learning how to prune, how to collect grapes without bruising them, how to spread them for drying. Her hands, once marked only by the scars of chains, now bore new calluses from honest labor. She felt a pride she had never known before, pride not in serving someone else, but in building something alongside him. One evening, after hours of gathering, they sat together in the courtyard with baskets of grapes stacked around them. The air was warm, filled with the sound of cicadas. Celine wiped the sweat from her brow, her tunic sticking to her skin, and looked across the courtyard to the olive grove. The graves there had always stirred questions in her. She had asked once and received an answer, but she felt the need to speak of it again. "You still visit them often," she said quietly. "Your wife and son." Gaius nodded, his gaze steady on the grove. "I do. It is not that I cannot let go. It is that I will not forget. They were my life." He paused, then turned to her. "But life changes. I thought I would end my days alone. That has changed too." Celine lowered her eyes, unsure how to respond. She understood what it meant to carry the dead with you. Her own family lived in her memory, not in the world. But for the first time, the thought did not make her feel only loss. Sitting beside Gaius, she felt the possibility of belonging again, not as a servant, not as property, but as herself. A question that might trouble anyone watching their story was finally answered that night. If she was free, why had she stayed? Why had she not taken the road out of Antioch, searching for another life elsewhere? The truth was simple. Freedom had been offered, but what she found here was more than freedom. She found safety, respect, and the beginning of trust. Leaving would have meant returning to emptiness. Staying meant building a life. When the last of the harvest was brought in, Gaius called her to the table inside the villa. The clay lamp lit the room in a soft glow. He placed a tablet on the table, marked with official writing. "Your manumission is written here," he said. "You are free not only because I said so, but in the eyes of Rome as well. No one may claim otherwise." Celine touched the tablet with trembling hands. It was real, undeniable proof. Her voice broke when she asked, "And if I stay, what am I then?" Gaius did not hesitate. "You are no longer a slave. You are no servant. You are my companion, if you wish to be." The words were plain, without flourish, but they struck deep. Celine's chest tightened, her eyes burning as she searched his face. He did not look at her with expectation, nor with pity. He looked at her as though she were equal, and for the first time, she believed it. She placed the tablet back on the table, steadying her voice. "Then I stay." That night, they ate together not as rescuer and rescued, not as master and freedwoman, but as two people who had chosen to share the same life. The silence between them was no longer heavy with fear or loss. It was calm, familiar, carrying the weight of understanding. The villa, once hollow and filled only with echoes of the past, now had voices again. Celine moved through it without hesitation, tending the fire, setting bread on the table, walking beside Gaius in the vineyard. He, in turn, no longer returned to an empty home. There was someone waiting, someone who made the walls feel alive again. Years of pain had shaped them both, but they did not end in pain. Their story ended in quiet certainty. Two broken lives joined, rebuilt not through grand promises or sudden passion, but through patience, work, and the simple choice to remain. For those who had doubted in the marketplace, for those who had laughed at the thought of buying a slave only to give her freedom, the answer lay here. Mercy had become family, and family had become love. And so, in the silence of the Roman countryside, under the wide sky and among the vines heavy with fruit, their lives went on together, no longer alone.